Welcome, friends. This is gonna be a tough one. Just look at the name. Decoding the Thing-In-Itself. What does that even mean? Well, we are looking today at the views of this gentleman right here. His name is Immanuel Kant. And that is a time period when he was around. And in particular, we're going to look at some of his metaphysical arguments or positions. And, well, I'm going to get into all the nitty-gritty with Kant. Don't worry, you'll get more Kant than you ever bargained for in this video and part 2 of the lesson on Immanuel Kant. However, first, I'm going to talk about something that totally doesn't seem relevant, and I promise you it is. So just hang in there with me. This right here is Jorge Luis Borges. Borges was an Argentine writer, and he turned blind towards the end of his life. And he wrote a lot of short stories, also essays and poetry. But we're going to focus today on one of his short stories, and you're probably wondering why. Just hang in there. Okay. He has one interesting story called, I don't know the name in English. That's funny. But it's about a character named Funes. Here's what happened to Funes. Funes, after falling off his horse, acquires the ability to remember everything. He recalls the shape of every cloud he looks at, the time that he saw them, these clouds, the temperature and the like, everything that you can possibly recall about an event of witnessing a cloud, Funes would have in his memory. This is a very peculiar thing to happen after you fall off a horse, probably impossible. But Borges was, he wrote fantasy. He tried to think really not only outside the box, but almost in magical ways. And by doing this, he would get us to think about our minds a little bit. Funes can also recall an entire day's events, a process that takes him an entire day to complete, since every single detail of the day is revisited in his memory. Just imagine every single thing that happens throughout your day, every thought that occurs to you, every movement of your down to your neck, right? Whichever way you're facing, all day long. That's how long it would take him to retell the story of, let's just say, the previous day. Why would he do this? Well, we'll get to that. Funes, in fact, no longer generalizes. For example, he doesn't think a dog at T1, time 1, is the same dog at T2. He sees one dog from the side, let's just say, at T1, and then another dog, this time frontally, at T2. It's just like in a movie frame, right? He sees, if you really slow down the projector, you can kind of see each individual frame going by of a movie. And of course, our mind does this for us. It just kind of weaves them together. We know that one frame leads to the next frame, and it just goes ahead and literally paints a picture for us, literally a motion picture, right? Well, in the case of Funes, he couldn't do that. He would just see one frame and then an entirely different frame. He did not generalize, meaning that he did not think, well, this is dog, let's just say Fido. This is Fido from one angle, and then Fido in a different angle. For him, these two time slices, T1 and T2, were entirely different events, and for all intents and purposes, entirely different dogs. Strange. Every time he would look in the mirror, Funes would see a different person, this time from a slightly different angle, or in a slightly darker room, or in a slightly colder climate. This is starting to get pretty weird, right? Could you imagine that every time you look in the mirror, you don't recognize who's there. Now, of course, there is sort of a psychologically traumatizing way to think about that. You don't recognize who you are anymore. But what's going on here is that every time he would look at himself, it would be like a different frame in a movie, except he wouldn't unify those frames. Just like with the dog, he is one thing in one frame and another thing in another frame, right? Just a different angle, let's just say. So without this capacity to forget, might be a good way to put it, he wasn't generalizing anymore. He didn't recognize himself as being identical both in T1 and T2. T1 is one person, one Funes, and T2 is a different person, another Funes. And so he was no longer able to blend or generalize or merge these different time slices that he perceived. What in the heck is Borges trying to tell us? Well, here is my summary of sort of what he's getting at. And this comes from a book, by the way, by a philosopher named Eggington. So here is what Borges is maybe saying. We, unlike Funes, don't just passively experience the world. When we experience different perceptual events, for example, T1 and T2, we perform mental functions to make sense of our experiences, such as the act of generalizing. We realize, in other words, that the dog at T1 is the same dog at T2, not from anything in the world, but from our own mind's structuring of our perceptions of the world. This is pretty deep, all right? But let's just go back to the frames. You see one frame of a dog at T1, and another frame of a dog at T2, and another one at T3 and T4. If you don't, with your mind's eye, sort of realize and generalize and make this dog the same dog at each time slice, then you are seeing 4 different dogs. But we don't do that. Our minds do this automatically for us. They generalize. They make the dog at T1 the same one as at T2, the same one as at T3. Our mind merges these distinct time frames for us. That's what Borges is saying. And by the way, that's exactly what Kant is saying too. So this dog gets blended for us by our minds, right? We could be like Funes. Actually, we can't be, but if we were like Funes, we would just see one dog here and then another dog there and a third dog over there. But our mind sort of blends it in for us and gets us to see this is actually motion. This is the category of motion. This is the category of dog. This is probably the same dog. This is running, right? Our mind does that for us. Well, Mr. Immanuel Kant was saying exactly that, except perhaps in an even more confusing way. Now, I'm doing my best here, but this might be one of those things that you have to pause and think about for a little bit. So let's see what Mr. Kant said. Kant's central thesis is that human beings experience only appearances, not things in themselves. And our experience of these appearances is structured by our faculty of understanding. So basically, Kant is saying there is the world that exists independent of our perceptions of it, and that we don't see as such. And there's also our representation of the world. And this representation of the world is generated for us by what he calls the faculty of our understanding. This is a, sort of common interpretation of Kant. It's not the only one, but let me give this some labels that might help here. There is the thing in itself, the world in itself, and there is our representation of it. And Kant has names for these. The noumenal realm is the thing in itself. The phenomenal realm is our representation of things in themselves. And if you accept this idea that there's two worlds, the world as it is, independent of our experiences, and the world that we construct with our mind, if you accept this idea, that is transcendental idealism that you're accepting. And this is Kant's contribution, one of his many contributions to the field of philosophy at this time period. I should add here that this is not some weird mystical claim. In fact, this is what various cognitive scientists and cognitive neuroscientists assume. There is the world as it is, independent of our cognition, and the world that we actually perceive when we construct our models of reality. Right? So this is a terribly modern perspective. On this view, all of our experiences of the world will be law-governed due to the structuring concepts through which we grasp our world, our cognition. Let me pause right there. You see a reality as your faculty of understanding constructs it for you. And because this faculty of understanding constructs it for you in a particular way, there will be a regularity to these perceptions of the world. That is what he means when he says these perceptions of the world are law-governed. We impose a structure on them. And we eventually start, giving names to these laws, right? This way that things work. And a hop, skip, and a jump away from there, we eventually come to call these the laws of nature. So the reason why we see such a regularity in our perceptions of the world is because our cognition imposes those regularities on our perceptions. And from that imposed structure, we get the laws of nature. In fact, according to Kant, even space and time are forms of human intuition and not things in themselves. In other words, time is constructed by our minds. Time is not something that you see actually out in reality. We temporalize our experiences of the world. Now, before you start thinking this is way too crazy to accept, this is actually what Einstein also said, right? Time is something that, it just doesn't exist independently of some observer, right? There is no privileged perspective by which we can, experience time. We experience time given relative, that's the word, right? Relative to our, how fast we're moving in space, basically. So this is, again, terribly modern and surprising that Kant was able to arrive at these conclusions by really just meditating on his personal experiences of the world. I should also note that this theory about time goes back to at least Augustine, which is about 1,000 years before this. But it is defended in an interesting and novel way here by Immanuel Kant. Kant will ultimately attempt to argue that human understanding, in other words, the capacity to judge, is the source of the laws of nature, and that human reason, in other words, the capacity to infer, is the source of moral law, which is the basis for our belief in God, freedom, and the immortality of the soul. So we have a couple of faculties at our disposal. One of them is to judge, and we've been talking about that this entire time. We can judge from one time frame to the other that there is some kind of structuring going on by our cognitive faculties, right? And basically, because of that structuring, we get the laws of nature. That's where the laws of nature come from. He also thinks we have this capacity for human reason, right? And eventually he will say that reason shows us there is a moral law. Reason can take us to fundamental moral precepts, things that we know we have to do, that it would be irrational to not do, and that is morality. And from this belief in morality, he says we can basically not prove that there is a God or that the soul is immortal, but that we are justified in believing as such, morally justified in believing as such. So that gets a little more complicated, and there will be another lesson on that. But the main point of this one is this capacity to judge, that our human understanding, that is what structures reality for us. And that is from where we even get this idea of the laws of nature. Now, this is where the big reveal comes. Because we exist in the noumenal realm, and the laws of nature only apply in the phenomenal realm, the laws of nature cannot threaten free will. Free will and the laws of nature exist in two separate realms. Let me make sure you caught that. And also let me make sure you ignore the typo on the screen. So what Kant is saying is, we, as human individuals, we're physical objects, right? We are things in themselves. We are the thing in itself. So we exist independent of our perceptions, right? But of course, as we've been talking about this entire time, the laws of nature, we get those from the structuring that we impose on the appearances of the world. In other words, we get the laws of nature only in the phenomenal realm and how it is that we perceive the world. So now we're in the noumenal realm. The laws of nature are in the phenomenal realm. Oh, but wait. Aren't the laws of nature the source of our skepticism about free will? Didn't it come from physics? Well, physics is now safely, should we say, sequestered in the phenomenal realm. It's just in the realm of appearances. We, of course, are in the noumenal realm, things in themselves. And so, determinism actually can't threaten free will. They are in two separate realms. And that is how Kant defends libertarian free will.